Here's the Palestinian ambassador to the UK who was brought on BBC and was immediately asked, as they always are, are you going to condemn, everything that Palestinians have ever done? Anyway, you'll see.
You just condemned Israel for killing civilians, and you won't condemn Hamas for killing civilians.
How many times you have interviewed Israeli officials, Louise? Hundreds of times. Hundreds of times. How many times Israel have committed war crimes right live on your own cameras? Do you start by asking them to condemn themselves? Have you? You don't. You don't. No, I'll answer that question. You don't.
I'm going to play the rest in just a second, but he's absolutely right. It's a complete hypocrisy when it comes to these interviews. Yes, they will sometimes have Palestinian representatives on to give their side of the issues, and sometimes they even give them fair airtime. Sometimes they even sit there and let them speak and let them give their view. That does happen occasionally on BBC or CNN. I mentioned one the other day, but the questions are completely different, and the way it's talked about are completely different. Israeli officials or U.S. officials who are, essentially Israeli officials because, the U.S. does propaganda for Israel. The U.S. government does, and the U.S. mainstream media does. So U.S. and Israeli officials, when they're brought on to talk about Israel, they're never asked immediately, do you condemn first question one out of the gate, do you condemn the IDF for shooting children and medics and press and elderly, unarmed people? Just murdering, just blanket bombing areas of Gaza. Do you condemn that? They never ask them that question. I don't know if I've ever seen them ask that question of these Israeli officials, U.S. government officials on our mainstream media, BBC, etc. So of course he's right. Never. Anyway, let's see the rest of what he said.
No, I refuse to answer this question because I refuse the premise of it. Because at the very heart of it is misrepresentation of the whole thing. Because it's the Palestinians that are always expected to condemn themselves. I mean, come on, this is a political conflict. We have been denied our rights for a long time. So this is the wrong starting point. The right starting point is to focus on the root causes, is to try and get out of this extreme dark tunnel, as opposed to this business by BBC and the mainstream media for 75 years. You bring us here whenever there are Israelis who are killed. Did you bring me here when many Palestinians in the West Bank, more than 200 over the last few months? Do you invite me when there is such Israeli provocations in Jerusalem and elsewhere? Because what Israelis have seen, which we...
And yet again, he's right. They'll have representatives like this on to talk about these issues after Israelis have been killed. They almost never have them on after Palestinians have been killed, which is far more regular, right? I showed you the numbers yesterday. Far more regularly, innocent Palestinians are murdered by the IDF, by Israel, and they're not having Palestinian officials on to give their take on things when that happens. No, they have them on after Israelis are murdered in this horrific apartheid-based war.
Do you invite me when there is such Israeli provocations in Jerusalem and elsewhere? Because what Israelis have seen, which we started by saying tragic, the last 48 hours, the Palestinians see every day for the last 50 years. You know the situation in Gaza, you've just described it. This is the biggest open-air prison.
All right, so that's the end of that clip. But he nailed it exactly. They carefully couch these things on the mainstream media. They carefully describe these things in such a way that it is meant to do propaganda for Israel, allowing for Israel's crimes while not allowing for response from Gaza, from Palestinians. And I've done whole segments on the way the mainstream media covers these stories, long segments on Redacted Tonight many times about how they'll, and luckily I've heard more coverage of this since I did my piece. I'm not saying everyone saw my piece, but I feel like I was a little ahead of the curve on it. How whenever the mainstream media covers Palestinian deaths, it's always with the passive voice. It's always Palestinians were killed. No, they don't even use. They don't even usually use killed. They usually say, deaths were recorded in Palestine, or sometimes they'll say Palestinians were killed. Sometimes they'll even say Palestinians got hit by bullets. Is one of my favorites. But when Israelis are killed, it is Hamas murdered Israelis, Hamas killed Israelis. They very carefully tell you who the perpetrator is. Whereas when Israel is murdering people, they leave it all passive. They go, oh, well, the Palestinians were killed. And that's the best you'll get. That's when they're covering Palestinian deaths, which most of the time they're not. Most of the time, it's very rare. In the Great March of Return, they started covering it because basically it was pushed to the point that the mainstream media could not ignore the story any longer. It was on every other outlet, and the mainstream media ultimately had to cover the Great March of Return to some extent. But like I said, I didn't get any of those articles to highlight on this live stream right now, but I have done that in the past. Whole segments showing that the New York Times, Washington Post, all of them will act like it's the passive voice, like it's a mystery person who has murdered Palestinians. Like bullets just rained down from somewhere. We don't know. It was a bullet storm from a cloud. And it just hit some folks. But I have seen more people talking about the difference in voice, the grammatical trickery used to basically do propaganda for the apartheid state of Israel.